The winter I remember most did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, like an old debt finally being collected. Snow settled into the hollows of the land, smoothing the sharp edges of the prairie until even sorrow looked gentle from a distance. I was a younger man then, though already worn thin by loss, and I did not yet know how a single act, small enough to fit inside a trembling hand, could redraw the shape of a life. My ranch sat a mile beyond the town of Coldwater Crossing, far enough that the church bell reached me only when the wind was feeling generous. The land was poor but honest. Fence posts leaned like tired men, and the barn roof sighed whenever the snow grew heavy. I spoke to the horses more than I spoke to people, not because I mistrusted men, but because words had grown expensive after my wife died. Silence, at least, never asked for more than I could give. That morning, the cold pressed against my ribs as I worked the pump. Water came up slow, stiff with ice, and I had to break the skin that formed overnight with the back of my glove. My hands were cracked and bleeding again. I did not bother wrapping them. Pain had become a language I understood without translation. I saddled Jonah, my old bay, and rode into town for supplies. Coldwater Crossing always looked smaller in winter, as if the buildings themselves were ashamed to be seen stripped of color. Smoke lifted from chimneys in thin, uncertain lines. A few men stood outside Boone's Mercantile, boots scraping, voices low. They went quiet when they saw me. Silas Boone watched from his doorway, fingers hooked into his vest. He had the sort of smile that never reached his eyes, a smile trained on profit and rumor. "Mornin', Crowder," he said, stretching my name like it tasted odd. "Cold one. Reckon even ghosts think twice before wandering out today." The men laughed softly. Not cruel laughter, not loud enough to draw the marshal's attention. The kind meant to remind a man where he stood. I nodded once, because refusing to react had become my only defense, and tied Jonah to the post. Inside the store, the air smelled of flour and kerosene. A woman stopped speaking when I passed her, eyes dropping to the counter as if she'd been caught stealing. I paid for my supplies, took my sack, and left without hurry. Letting them rush me would have been another kind of surrender. On the ride back, the sky began to change. Clouds thickened, low and heavy, their bellies dark with more snow. Jonah's breath steamed, steady and calm, and I let that rhythm carry me. It was then I saw her. At first, I thought she was a fallen tree, dark against the white near the frozen creek. But trees do not rise and fall with breath. I reined in, heart tightening, the old stories waking in me like bad dreams. Apache land stretched not far from here, and fear had a way of filling gaps where understanding should have lived. She was large, larger than any woman I had ever seen, and laid half-curled in the snow, one arm tucked beneath her, the other outstretched as if she had reached for something just beyond her grasp. Her hair spilled across the ice in a black arc, already dusted white. Her face was strong, the lines of it carved with a dignity that even exhaustion could not erase. I stayed on the horse longer than I should have. The world seemed to narrow, sound dimming until all I could hear was my own pulse. Every lesson the frontier ever taught a man argued for leaving. But another memory rose just as sharp. My wife, Sarah, pressing a cup of water into a stranger's hands during the drought years, whispering that mercy was not something you saved for safe moments. I dismounted. My boots crunched too loud, and her eyes opened at once. Dark, alert, wary. She did not scramble away. She did not beg. She watched me the way one watches a storm, measuring distance, waiting for intent to reveal itself. I lifted my hand slow. Words crowded my throat and died there. Anything I said would have been clumsy, heavy with all the history between us. Instead, I reached for my canteen. The metal was cold enough to sting. I unscrewed the cap and held it out, arms shaking more from what the moment carried than from the cold. For a long breath, she did not move. Snow began again, soft flakes drifting between us, settling on her lashes. Then she pushed herself up just enough to drink. Her fingers brushed mine, brief, electric, and I felt the weight of that touch travel straight through me. She drank deeply, then once more, before lowering the canteen and holding it against her chest as if it were something fragile. Our eyes met. In that instant, I did not see an enemy, or a legend, or a threat. I saw a person who had been brought low by winter and had not yet decided whether the world was worth rising for. She handed the canteen back without a word, stood on unsteady legs, and turned away. She did not look back. Her tracks filled quickly with snow. I watched until she was gone, the silence closing around me again. Only then did I realize how hard I was breathing. That night, the wind worried the walls of the house like it wanted entry. I sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a tin cup, replaying the moment until it felt unreal, like something borrowed from another man's life. Fear came late, creeping in after the fire burned low. I thought of retaliation, of lines crossed without permission. I thought of the way her eyes had held mine, not with anger, but with a question. Sleep came in fragments. Each time I woke, the house felt smaller. Dawn broke pale and unforgiving. I stepped onto the porch, breath fogging, and followed the line of the hills with my eyes. At first, I thought the shadows were tricks of the light. Then one moved. Then another. Horses stood along the ridge, their riders still as stone. Not one or two. Hundreds. They were not advancing. They were waiting. The cold no longer touched me. I stood there alone, the echo of a simple kindness heavy in my chest, and understood that whatever I had begun could not be undone. They stayed on the ridge through the morning, dark figures against the white, unmoving as if carved from the land itself. The horses shifted now and then, stamping snow, but the riders did not speak. Silence gathered weight. It pressed against the ranch until even the board seemed to listen. I stood on the porch longer than my body wanted to, my breath steady only because panic had nowhere useful to go. By mid-morning, the town knew. Fear travels faster than reason, especially when it has something familiar to wear. A boy came hard down the road, coat flapping, eyes wide. He did not stop, only shouted that there were Apaches on the hills, that men were loading rifles, that the marshal was shouting orders he did not believe in. I nodded, because nodding cost less than arguing. When the boy vanished, the quiet returned, thicker than before. I could have fled. The land behind the ranch opened into miles of scrub and frozen draws, and Jonah would have carried me if I asked. The thought passed through me without staying. Running would have turned that cup of water into a lie, and lies have a way of poisoning even what they mean to save. I set my hands on the rail and waited. They began to move near noon. Not all at once. A slow ripple. Horses descending the ridge in long arcs that curved toward the house, without haste. The sound came gradually. Leather breath. The low murmur of voices I could not understand but did not mistake for anger. Snow fell again. Fat flakes that softened edges and slowed time, as if the world itself were asking for care. When they were close enough that I could see faces, a single rider separated from the rest. She rode with her back straight, head bare to the cold, hair bound with a strip of red cloth. I knew her by the way she held herself, by the dignity that had not broken even when she lay half-buried in ice. She stopped a few paces from the porch and dismounted, boots meeting snow without sound. I did not move. I had learned that there are moments when stillness is the only honest answer. She looked at me for a long while, and in her gaze was no accusation. If anything, there was relief, tempered by something like sorrow. She spoke then, her voice low and even, the words unfamiliar but their intent clear enough. I heard my own name, shaped carefully, as if it mattered that it be said right. I stepped down from the porch and brought the canteen with me. It felt right to keep the language the same. I unscrewed the cap and held it out, not as a shield, not as a plea, but as it had been before, an offering that did not demand a future. She took it, drank once, and handed it back. The smallest of smiles touched her mouth, and was gone. Behind her, the circle closed. Horses fanned out until the ranch sat at the center of a living ring. I felt their attention not as threat, but as gravity. The town gathered at a distance, a knot of coats and fear, eyes bright with a curiosity that could not admit its own hunger. I saw Silas Boone among them, his face pale, lips working without sound. The marshal stood stiffly beside him, hands resting on a courage he did not trust. An older man rode forward then, his hair silver beneath a broad hat, his presence quieting the space around him. He dismounted and came to stand beside the woman, his gaze settling on me, with a weight that did not crush. He spoke, and though I did not know the words, I knew the shape of what he said. This was her father. This was a man accustomed to being listened to. She translated for him in careful phrases, choosing each one as if it mattered to place it well. She told me her name, Naeli, and said she had fallen while crossing the low ground, the fever taking her strength before she could reach safety. She told me they had followed her trail through the storm, that they had feared the worst when it vanished near the creek. She told me that when she woke, it was not to a blade or a rope, but to water offered without condition. Her father spoke again. The circle leaned in, not closer, but more attentive, as if even the snow wanted to hear. Naeli turned to me and said that among her people, a kindness given at the edge of danger carried great weight. It bound not with obligation, but with witness. She said he had come to look upon the man who had done this thing, to see whether the act and the heart that shaped it matched. I felt every eye on me then. The old urge to explain rose up, to speak of my wife, of loss, of how fear had hollowed me until there was room for mercy. I let it pass. Some truths do not improve when handled too much. Instead, I nodded and said only that I had done what I hoped someone would have done for me. The chief studied me a moment longer, then inclined his head. It was not a bow. It was acknowledgment. He spoke, and Naeli's voice carried his words to me, that this land would know my name as one spoken without shame, that no harm would come to me from his people, that the circle around my house was not a threat, but a promise kept. The warriors dismounted as one. They did not cheer. They did not mark the moment with noise. They stood, hands resting easy, faces open. The town exhaled in a sound like wind through dead grass. Boone's shoulders sagged. The marshal lowered his hands and looked, briefly, like a man grateful to be spared himself. Snow thickened, blurring the distance between us all. The chief mounted and turned his horse, the others following, the circle opening as gently as it had closed. Naeli lingered. She reached into her coat and drew out a small cord of beads, worn smooth by time. She placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. Her touch was firm, grounding. For remembrance, she said, not of fear, of choice. They left without hurry, the ridge swallowing them one by one until only tracks remained, already softening. The town drifted back to its routines, chastened and quieter. That evening, a loaf of bread appeared on my porch, still warm. No note. I ate it slowly, tasting more than flour. Naeli stayed the night, not as a guest claimed, not as a promise made. She slept by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, the beads now tied at her wrist. We spoke little. When words came, they were simple, shared like coals between palms. In the morning, she left with the sun, turning once to look back, her expression steady and unburdened. Winter did not soften after that. It did not need to. Something else had. The land remained what it was, but I moved through it differently, as if I had been granted permission to stand where I stood. People in town met my eyes now, some with regret, some with something like respect. I did not need either. What I carried was quieter and harder to lose. I tell you this because winters still come, and so do moments that ask who you are when no one is watching closely enough to reward you. If there is a lesson here, it is not about bravery or borders. It is about the way small mercies ripple outward, touching lives you may never see, returning to you changed. If this story stayed with you, if it warmed some hidden place, stay a while longer. Subscribe to Wild West Tales, and we'll keep remembering together.